Welcome to the pre-lecture for Industrial Ecology, Fall 2018, Week 6. I'm Joshua Skov. So the overview of the week, a little bit on GRI, and then a couple of examples of reporting, broadly defined, companies that don't appear to have much in common and indeed have chosen really different paths, Patagonia and Nestle, but both trying to make a case. And then next week we'll move on to what I label pre-competitive efforts. I think you'll see how it relates to the material we're covering this week as well. There will be a pop quiz, but not so pop. You are getting this here in advance. Just take a look at the fill-in-the-blank opportunities there, and we will walk through them. I'm hoping that filling in these blanks will be a step toward being able to do this entirely on your own from scratch. So, GRI and materiality, which I think will come to be one and the same in your minds, or at least you'll see that they are nearly one and the same in my mind. Let me dive in. So, GRI. As you take a look at this, I think you're going to see some problems. I want to call them out now, the ones I see as big challenges. There's just too much. There is so much GRI material, and it's easy to drown in that. I would also say sometimes it's hard to figure out what a quick and easy version would be if one were to attempt it. Also, everyone wants to be comparable, and I think this is part of the motivation behind GRI. But you know, in some important ways, it's just impossible, right? Ultimately, sustainability reporting has to be different in different contexts. So that's one of the challenges we'll run into. So my advice when engaging with the GRI material, let me lay this out. Focus first and foremost on materiality. You want to draw the right boundaries around the things that matter for the company and what the company's stakeholders really care about. This will be job one. And for a particular situation, you want to figure out which principles are challenging to live up to. You'll see the principles in the readings, and we'll chat about a few of them. But I think that's maybe the hardest part in actually engaging in the exercise. Though that doesn't mean it's always hard. It just means that you want to figure out which principles are going to be challenging, and then also cherry pick as appropriate. When you get out there in the real world and you are designing some sort of sustainability reporting for your own company or for a client firm, you need to scale your effort. You're not all going to be in a position where you can produce a report like the one you see from Nestle, which is long and lavish and complex and engaged many stakeholders and surely involved hundreds of thousands of dollars in effort. But that doesn't mean you can't do something meaningful. You just need to scale the effort right. And we'll talk about that as we go. So the GRI material, you have a bundle of pieces that have been called out. I do want to get your reaction to the two little videos. They're pretty short. Empowering Sustainable Decisions and Bringing All Stakeholders to the Table. I should say one's short and one's very short. And then you are also reading pieces of the reporting principles. Come with that stuff in mind as well. So what are my expectations with all of this? Let me be clear up front with the intended learning outcomes. You should understand the key aspects of the reporting principles and really be able to talk about those things. So don't just make flashcards. I mean, some of this is about understanding, not just memorizing. You should have a sense of the overall purpose of GRI. I have hinted at this before. We talked about it in week 2. We'll say a little more this week. You should also have a sense of the general shape of all of these different moving parts. Again, I don't want you to read them all or try to engage with every last little piece of detail, but get a sense of what's there. So poke around a little bit. And then you should also understand why it has emerged as an expectation in the business world. That is perhaps the trickiest part, but that's what we want to understand. It's the other side of the coin from the overall purpose, but we'll want to understand why this is table stakes in many settings. Now, to be clear, we are dabbling, not reading comprehensively, right? There's a ton of stuff there that we could go over, and we're not doing that. So that means you aren't expected to read everything, but you must read enough to achieve these learning goals laid out above. You aren't expected to download everything, I mean, you can if you want, but you should explore enough that you could find something if you needed to in real life. That's certainly my hope, that you've wandered the labyrinth enough to know where a few things are. And then finally, you should understand GRI's limitations. And, I opened with problems with GRI, but you can't just dismiss it. It's easy to say, oh, this is flawed or it's incomplete. It doesn't do everything that it might. But that's not the point. The point is to be clear about its purpose and also its business value. And I believe there's quite a bit there. So GRI reporting principles, I'll talk about this a little bit in class. Some of this is just waiting to be made fun of, but we will focus on the thing that matters most, and that really is materiality. I will make these points with a little more time in class, but all of this stuff for me boils down to materiality. It leads back to it. It doesn't mean that it isn't helpful to call out the concept of sustainability context or stakeholder inclusiveness. I do think that is useful, but it is important to say that it is impossible to do these other things if you haven't done materiality fully and correctly, and so that really is the foundation, and that'll be one of the biggest points I try to drive home. Let me just look ahead for a moment to Patagonia before I spend some more time on materiality. I think it will be interesting because Patagonia does not follow a format like GRI to ask a few detailed questions, and I've found in previous years that students often want to do this for a reflection. I want you to ask, does all this material you see on the web from Patagonia in aggregate, taken as a whole, meet these reporting principles as laid out by GRI, even though this isn't officially a GRI report or a GRI compliant effort? Are there other things that you would want to know that are not called out here? Also, I want you to give a reason why Patagonia should do a GRI report and give a reason why Patagonia should stay on its current path if you choose this material for reflection. In other words, say why it's fine as is and also why it might not be. I think that's a helpful exercise to take both sides. I will take a moment going over this materiality definition. I think it's worth pointing out all the things that are potentially in the eye of the beholder, but that doesn't mean it isn't going to be a helpful guide. So we'll spend a little bit of time with it. So materiality has a neat definition. I think where the rubber meets the road and where you can actually start to put things on paper usefully and think with them is in this basic tool known as the materiality matrix. We'll have a couple of these examples from Mars, the big giant privately held global candy company, and Engie, a big French energy company, a utility but also involved in renewables development and some other things in the energy space. So a few things about this. What is a materiality matrix? Very simply, it's a graph plotting issues on two axes, the importance to the firm versus importance to stakeholders, typically on the horizontal and vertical axes respectively. That's what you see in these two examples. Pretty simple, right? You can think about these things from the standpoint of how important they are for the business, narrowly defined, and then again, how important they are to external folks who pay attention to the business. So what are the questions to ask of a materiality matrix? I'll suggest it this way. I'll have a little more in a moment. First of all, what are the big issues? And when you look at a final one of these, you can start in the upper right and say these are the things ranked highly internally and externally. Also ask, are there things that are missing, right? This is typically published by the company. So you might say, oh, there's some things that have been left out. Also, what other context and framing does the company provide? I'm going to focus on the matrix, the materiality matrix itself, but these are always accompanied by other material, so that other context is going to be awfully important. And then, just as a trick, I think, to organize your thoughts, I will often say it this way: what can we learn about items that are far from the y equals x line? In other words, if you draw a straight line from the lower left corner to the upper right corner, a lot of things are bunched near that line, but a handful of things typically are way off on one side or the other. What can we learn about those things? And what can we learn about the company's framing of how it sees issues versus how its stakeholders C issues. So a few more details here. Look at the upper right. That's where the consensus is. Maybe the company also wants to draw attention to the consensus. Remember, this is a way to build credibility and trust. We care too, they're saying, if they put issues that are important to stakeholders in that upper right. Next, take a look at what's in the upper left. Right? Those are things that, and maybe not way far in the upper left, but those are the items that the company doesn't care that much about, but feels obligated to acknowledge. They're showing up on the matrix, and that's because stakeholders care about them. I would say it this way: by putting an item, well off the y equals x line in the direction of the upper left corner, the company is saying, we acknowledge that stakeholders care about these issues, but they aren't that important for our business. That's helpful. Conversely, we can take a look at what's in the lower right. Those are the items the company cares about and wants to flag for the rest of the world. By putting them in the upper right, the company is saying, we acknowledge that stakeholders don't seem to care much about these issues, but they are important for our business. Here's the example from Mars. We'll talk about that a little bit more in class, but I want you to have it to mull over. And you can see lots of things bundled near that y equals x line, but there are quite a few things off on one side or another, so that's worth talking through. And then Angie's matrix looks like this. Again, pretty helpful that things are in very different places. They've also done a little more to tag these issues in different categories. You see at the bottom there's a legend. So there's a lot going on here, but we'll have a chance to talk through various pieces of it. I will have an activity where you will make a materiality matrix. You will do this for Intel. I don't think I'm going to say more right now, well, except for the topics that I want you to consider. Human rights, water, worker health and safety, and privacy and data security. You might start thinking about that now. How important will Intel say those are to itself as a company, to its business, versus how important they are to external stakeholders? So that will be the activity that we'll do in class on this. All of this materiality work is going to relate to your final assignment, so that'll keep popping up, but this will be the main exercise we'll do related to GRI in class. Now, there will be another quick twist on materiality. I'll want to show you Deleuze. This is an interesting food company, a food retail company that is kind of global, a lot of operations in Europe and the United States, and you see their matrix there. I'll just point out that while normally the axes are how much something matters to stakeholders versus how much something matters to our business, to the firm itself, Deleuze will have a very different take. They'll have how much something matters to stakeholders versus how big an impact it is environmentally and socially, and they make a case for this. And again, you can see quite a bit of scatter there in that matrix. That's helpful, right? Because clearly they're trying to show some divergence of people's perceptions, external stakeholders' perceptions of these issues versus their internal understanding of how big a deal things are. So we'll try to stop in on this one as well. So Patagonia and Nestle, briefly, and then much more in class. So in our first week, I laid out what I meant by frameworks and why I think they're important. You see my questions that I think are worthwhile there at the bottom in bold print. I will also just point out that what you are seeing this week from Patagonia and from Nestle are frameworks. In one case, Patagonia is way off the beaten path. They're not using somebody else's off-the-shelf framework for the most part, and they're creating something on their own, whereas Nestle has quite relentlessly referred to GRI and responded to CDP and also invokes the SDGs along the way. So they're extremely frameworkified using these externally credible tools. So we'll keep both these in mind because they're both frameworks. You could say Nestle has a framework and Patagonia has a framework. They're just doing different things and referring to what's out there to very different extents. So a few quick things. I will want you to have reacted to these videos that you saw in the context of Patagonia and Nestle. I mean, you saw those videos and the reporting principles. Let's try to ask whether what these companies are doing really represents the principles laid out by GRI. Again, that's regardless of whether they have followed GRI or not, but rather we're going to think at a little higher level and say, do these things capture the spirit of GRI? And that's trickier, right? Because you could be following the letter, but not the spirit. Maybe that's the case, you'll believe, for Nestle. And you could be following none of the letter, but completely adhering to the spirit. That could theoretically be the case for Patagonia. So let's not be fooled by the bespoke or custom nature of Patagonia's reporting and Nestle's diligent teaching to the test. Those things might distract us a little bit, or not. That's what we'll assess critically. So quickly on these companies, Patagonia is a widely acknowledged leader on a whole series of sustainability issues. All of the stuff on the website is evidence that someone really cares about disclosure. In aggregate, these things are pretty detailed. I would say that the Footprint Chronicles alone is a bold transparency move, and certainly when it came out about a decade ago, it was unique in this space. And then it's important to say that it's not just this company's reporting that's different, its brand focus is different. It has a different relationship with the consumer, and we'll want to incorporate that in here a little bit. Your average Patagonia consumer is not your average consumer in the economy at large. And then for Nestle, this is a giant company active essentially everywhere in the world, perhaps 200 countries. I would say in some ways it's kind of culturally significant. I love having Nestle as a topic in the same week as Halloween because, well, there'll be evidence of that in class. And it's dominant in some product classes that, frankly, are linked to some emerging problems. You'll see all this material on different aspects of nutrition, and we have both malnutrition and obesity in different parts of the developed and developing worlds. So Nestle might appear to be on the hook in a variety of ways. There's, again, evidence at Nestle that someone cares about disclosure. This is a big effort. I challenge folks who may have some frame of reference for this to estimate how much that Nestle report, the Creating Shared Value report, cost. Not a cheap little weekend effort put together in WordPress. This is a big deal. And sure enough, Nestle's reporting has actually been widely praised. It scores very well when people get around to scoring GRI and CDP reporting. So those are all important pieces. So I'd like to hear your reactions to these things as we go. So a few other elements to consider. I want to make sure you've been through all of these pieces as called out on Canvas, and similarly in Nestle, make sure you've looked at these different pieces. I'm trying to be as surgical as possible because otherwise you could fall into Patagonia's website or Nestle's report, even just the Creating Shared Value report, forget about the rest of the website for a long time. But I don't think that's a great use of our time. So I'll hope that you'll make sure you get to all of these pieces. And again, I'll refer you back to what I said about how to read a materiality matrix when we look at Nestle in particular. So we'll be able to follow this advice, not just for the other examples we have, but for Nestle, especially in the context of the other reporting that we're doing. So you'll find this materiality matrix, and I want you to spend just a little bit of time with it so we know what we're up to. All of this will lead us back to this critique that I wrote that you had earlier in the course. I won't narrate this in detail here, but I want to call out just a few things. Really try to understand where I'm coming from, and in particular, that McKibben quote that I have early on. It's from a narrow context, but you can broaden it, and I want you to be able to do that. I am curious if the concerns that I've articulated in that piece relate to your experience. Come with that as well. And then in light of this week 6 material, Are these companies making genuine progress? Do you see that from Patagonia and Nestle? Also, do their efforts appear important and meaningful, but potentially lack specifics, right? And that's an important possible critique. It's not saying you're definitely failing. It's saying maybe you're doing the right thing, but you haven't told me enough for me to know. I think that's a helpful thing to keep in mind. And again, as you do all of this, I think this content stands on its own, but also keep these things in mind for your sustainability strategy assessment. To some extent, week 6 is where we do some of the most direct critique that's useful for you to think about for what comes next. We will spend a little bit of time on big food and the global obesity crisis, probably mainly on Wednesday. I do think this is a tremendous article. Again, it's journalism focused largely, but not exclusively, on Nestle, looking specifically at one of the world's biggest economies, one of the world's most populous countries. Brazil is a totally reasonable focus for us to have for something like this. But it's also part of a bigger series that the New York Times did that you can get to as well. A few quick questions to ask. Is this the responsibility of the business world? Sometimes this feels uncomfortably like being stretched into public policy, and we'll ask whether this is instead a public policy issue, or is this up to individuals, and are we not diagnosing the problem here? There won't be any one answer. I'm guessing we'll have a vigorous discussion about it. And with respect to Nestle in particular, does the company have a strategy in response, and what are those concerns? And where you see the company documenting its efforts on health, do you believe them? I'm very curious to hear your reaction to that, and specifically to Nestle's metrics. It has some fairly narrow metrics that we'll touch on. So some of these elements to consider in Nestle, we mentioned all of these pieces already out of the Creating Shared Value report. And then I'll want you to consider this handful of questions. I won't read those right now. You can take a look at them, but definitely think about this one at the bottom. Is Nestle a big pivot business? Using Andrew Winston's criterion from his book. What do you think? That's a tricky one. Curious to hear your thoughts. These are the metrics that we will pick away at in class on sugar, sodium, and saturated fats. This is where you would say Nestle is playing in a space that has clear connections, right? It is in product classes that have clear connections to very big problems, very big health problems globally, and often in quite different places, not just in the developed world, not just in the developing world. So I want to hear how you feel those metrics come through. And then finally, we will focus on sugar. I think this is maybe the easiest one to do, and also the best one to do the week of Thanksgiving. So some qualitative questions you see there below, some quantitative questions, and then I want you to try to guess about Nestle's strategy. Should they be doing more? If they should be doing more, why wouldn't they be doing it? But also, why are they doing this at all? Some of this may raise your eyebrows and make you think, wow, I'm impressed that they're even taking action here. So we'll want to try to understand this. Are they miserably falling short, or kind of out on a limb doing something that they don't have to? Curious to hear your take. All right, that's the pre-lecture for week 6. Thank you. See you in class.